Thanks so much, Sir Jarvis. Really enjoyed your presentation. So you're looking at the difference between local currency defaults and borrowing in a foreign currency. And the question I've got for you is that could you just kind of explain the situation that a government would be in where it would decide to borrow in foreign currency rather than borrow in its own currency? Because the Scottish Government at the moment have made the decision that they will use sterling for a decade, so they will be borrowing in foreign currency. May not be sterling, maybe other currencies, but they won't be able to borrow in their own currency because they're not issuing the currency. Could you just explain what the differences would be when you're looking at the problems that could arise if debt becomes an issue in a foreign currency?
Thanks for having me. I can hardly understate how terrible an idea it is to borrow in a foreign currency. Borrowing in a foreign currency is the single biggest predictor of debt default, government sovereign default. To give you an idea, for the year 2022, only less than 3% of outstanding default, as measured by the Bank of England and Bank of Canada in their official sovereign default database, occurred in local currency, domestic currency, meaning more than 97% of outstanding default happened when countries have borrowed in a currency that is not theirs, whether it is the US dollar predominantly, or the euro, or any other currency that they do not issue. Why this makes such a difference is the following. To give you an idea, in the case of Greece in 2010, when the markets, when investors could not hold Greek debt anymore because the debt had been downgraded too much by rating agencies, the European Central Bank decided not to intervene, which practically contravenes the reason why central banks were created.
When intervene would have been buying the government debt.
Absolutely. And by the way, this is what they did during the pandemic. Under the control of Christine Lagarde, the European Central Bank agreed to buy Greek government debt during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the result was outstanding. The maturity of the yields of Greek government bonds on the way to 5 years, so that's quite a span, went below zero. They entered the negative yield area, which was absolutely unthinkable before. So what is very important is to understand the concept of lender of last resort. The problem when you borrow in a foreign currency is that you lose your lender of last resort. And this is why I would strongly advise Scotland in particular not to use someone else's currency that they don't have an active cooperation with. And to the best of my knowledge, the UK, without Scotland, has already announced that it would not be cooperative. Really. So Scotland would basically be a passenger on someone else's train. It would not be...
Which is the position we have now. So expecting anything significantly different from having the same position doesn't really make much logical sense, does it?
Well, at the moment, again, to the best of my understanding, Scotland is somewhat has constraints around what it can borrow as a nation, as an entity.
It's tiny, it's 500 million a year.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So if this became limitless because on fiscal policy purpose, industrial policy, the problem is if for whatever reason markets become defined, and by the way, they can become defined not because you're doing something wrong, but maybe because there's a shock somewhere else. Like financial history is paved with events where investors decide to withdraw from a country, not because that country is doing badly, but because there's a massive hole in their portfolio because of a crisis, for instance, in the US. And you find that all across the world, including in Denmark. In Denmark, in 2008, the country suffered recurrent outflows during the month of October because North American investors were repatriating capitals away from many countries, including Denmark, to North America. And Denmark is a very strong place. Yeah. Now, Denmark has its own currency. That's the difference. In the case of Scotland, if for whatever reason investors decided to withdraw from Scotland and to push the yields up, so the bond price is down, without its own central bank and issuing debt in its own currency, Scotland would basically be at risk of seeing the interest rate on its debt go up and up and up, constrain it fiscally, and put it in a situation of default.
And we would have to rely on the Bank of England to come in effectively buy Scottish bonds because they're in the currency that only the central bank can purchase.
Absolutely, which they said they wouldn't do, again, to the best of my knowledge. And which
Well, even if they said they would, you're still in a position where you're giving that, effectively, that sovereignty to the Bank of England, whereas if you have a central bank that reports to the Scottish Government, then they have to do what the Scottish Government legislates them to do, whereas the Bank of England are completely under the control of the Westminster Government, so they could do anything.
And it would certainly come with conditions.
Yeah.
Absolutely.